Look at the corner of your phone screen. Right now, it displays a time synchronized down to the millisecond, automatically adjusting as you cross invisible state lines. Every aspect of modern life, from corporate management trees and stock portfolios to federal regulations, operates on an invisible, highly synchronized grid. We take this grid for granted, assuming it was handed down by government decree or designed by modern tech companies. But if you took that phone back to Chicago in 1880, your clock would be wrong by 7 minutes in St. Louis, 12 minutes in Omaha, and 23 minutes in Detroit. For the first half of American history, time was not a national grid. It was local, natural, and solar. Communities set their town clocks by noon, the precise moment the sun reached its highest point directly overhead. Because the Earth rotates, solar noon shifts by 4 seconds for every degree of longitude you travel east or west. As a result, 19th century America was a patchwork of over 300 distinct local sun times. For a society moving at the speed of a draft horse or a riverboat, local solar time worked perfectly. Commerce was conducted face-to-face within the visual line of sight of local owner-operators. But when steam-powered iron locomotives began rolling across the countryside at 30 miles per hour, local solar time turned into a logistical nightmare. By the 1870s, 53 separate railroad companies operated across the United States, each running on its own arbitrary time standard, usually based on the solar time of its home terminal. At major Union stations, passengers faced walls lined with dozens of different clocks displaying conflicting times for arriving and departing trains. This was not just confusing, it was fatal. Most American railroads operated on a single track to save construction costs. Trains traveling in opposite directions relied on precise timetable schedules to pull into designated sidings and let each other pass. If a conductor's pocket watch was off by 3 minutes, or if an engineer calculated speed using a local sun time 5 miles down the track, two 30-ton steam engines met head-on at full speed. To survive its own technological momentum, America had to build an entirely new system of human organization. By the early 1850s, railroad executives realized they faced a problem no business in human history had ever encountered. Before the steam engine, even the largest commercial enterprises, textile mills, shipping firms, merchant banks, were managed by a handful of partners who personally supervised their employees. No private enterprise operated beyond the visual line of sight of its owner. The Erie Railroad changed that. By 1854, its iron track stretched nearly 500 miles across New York State, employing thousands of conductors, engineers, track layers, and station agents. Rates of accidents soared, equipment went missing, and operating costs outpaced revenues. Traditional owner-managers were completely helpless. No single human being could physically oversee 500 miles of moving assets. To fix this, Daniel McCallum, the general superintendent of the Erie Railroad, designed a revolutionary tool in 1854, the world's first formal corporate organizational chart. Styled like a tree, McCallum's diagram illustrated a strict hierarchical chain of command. Board members and the president formed the roots, executive officers formed the trunk, divisional superintendents formed the main branches, and local conductors, station agents, and track crews formed the leaves. McCallum introduced a system where operational authority was separated by geographic divisions, but information flowed continuously upward to central headquarters. Every superintendent was required to submit daily, hourly, and telegraphic reports detailing passenger counts, freight tonnage, fuel consumption, and exact train locations. Concurrently, J. Edgar Thompson at the Pennsylvania Railroad refined this model by creating the concept of divisional cost accounting. For the first time, managers could calculate the precise cost of moving 1 ton of freight across 1 mile of track, the ton-mile metric. This was the birth of middle management, a salaried class of professional administrators who did not own the business, but spent their lives gathering data, managing organizational charts, and enforcing corporate rules across vast distances. The modern corporate office building, complete with its departmental hierarchies, executive suites, and standardized reporting metrics, was not invented in a modern skyscraper. It was engineered by rail executives trying to keep steam locomotives from crashing into one another. Managing thousands of distant employees required clear operational charts, but laying thousands of miles of iron track required capital on a scale no single person or local bank possessed. Building thousands of miles of iron track, purchasing fleets of locomotives, and maintaining complex organizational networks required capital on a scale that had never existed in the private sector. In the 1830s, an ordinary manufacturing business could be launched with a few $1,000s collected from family members or local partners. A major railroad, by contrast, required millions of dollars before a single passenger bought a ticket. Neither local merchant banks nor state governments possessed the financial capacity to fund these private megaprojects. The railroads had to tap into national and international financial markets, turning directly to Wall Street. To pull in this capital, rail companies pioneered the widespread use of corporate bonds, debt securities backed by the physical assets of the railroad, alongside common and preferred stocks. Investment banking firms transformed the New York Stock Exchange from a sleepy regional equity market into the central clearinghouse for international financial capital. By the 1870s, railroad securities dominated the trading floor of the NRHSE, accounting for the vast majority of all traded corporate assets. European investors from London, Amsterdam, and Frankfurt funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into American railroad bonds. This financial engine created modern investment capitalism. The concepts of corporate credit ratings, underwriting syndicates, stock ticker standardization, and institutional bond portfolios were all developed specifically to funnel global money into American rail lines. Wall Street grew into the financial beating heart of America largely because iron tracks required capital on a scale no single bank or local community could supply. But even the deep financial reserves of Wall Street hit a limit when faced with thousands of miles of unmapped Western territory. To span an entire continent, private rail corporations needed the sovereign authority of the federal government. In July 1862, in the darkest days of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. The law authorized the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies to construct a continuous transcontinental rail line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. Because private investors viewed building a railroad across thousands of miles of unmapped mountains, deserts, and plains as an impossibly risky gamble, the federal government stepped in with an unprecedented corporate subsidy. Congress did not merely loan money to the rail companies, it granted them public land. Under the 1862 Act and its expanded 1864 revision, the federal government granted rail companies 10 to 20 square miles of public land for every single mile of track laid, arranged in a checkerboard pattern along the right-of-way. In total, the federal government transferred over 130 million acres of land directly to private railroad corporations, an area larger than the entire state of California. In addition, the government issued federal bonds paying up to $48,000 per mile of track constructed through mountainous terrain. On May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, a golden spike was driven into the ground, connecting the Union Pacific and Central Pacific tracks. Telegraph operators wired the single word "done" to newsrooms across the country, triggering church bells and celebratory cannon fire in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Promotional materials framed the Transcontinental Railroad as a triumph of rugged frontier individualism, but the historical reality was far more complex. It was America's first major exercise in state-subsidized corporate planning. The federal government had used its sovereign authority and public domain to create mega-corporations, reshaping the geography of the American West long before settlers ever arrived. Once the tracks bridged the continent, they did not just move physical items faster, they fundamentally altered how Americans bought, sold, and valued raw materials. Once the tracks bridged the continent, the railroad did something even more profound than moving goods faster. It fundamentally altered how human beings related to the natural world and the commodities they produced. Before the 1850s, trade in physical goods was bound to geography and season. A farmer harvested wheat, poured it into distinct canvas sacks, loaded it onto a wagon, and sold those exact sacks to a merchant who evaluated their quality by hand. The physical crop, its origin, and its owner were inseparable. When rail lines converged on Chicago, millions of bushels of grain flooded into the city at unprecedented speeds. Railroad cars could not sit idle, waiting for individual sacks to be loaded and unloaded by hand. To keep trains moving, Chicago entrepreneurs built massive steam-powered grain elevators. In 1848, merchants founded the Chicago Board of Trade to manage this flood of grain. Instead of keeping each farmer's crop separate, grain elevators pumped thousands of bushels of wheat into collective towering silos. To make this work, the Board of Trade established standardized grain grades in 1856, such as No. 1 Northern Spring Wheat, and introduced formal rules for futures contracts by 1865. It no longer mattered whose farm the wheat came from or who grew it. As long as it met the official technical grade, it was mixed together with millions of other pounds of grain. This abstraction gave birth to modern financial futures trading. Merchants no longer traded physical sacks of wheat sitting on a dock. They traded standardized receipts representing a specific grade and quantity of grain to be delivered in the future. The railroad and the grain elevator decoupled the financial value of a crop from its physical reality. Simultaneously, mail-order pioneers like Montgomery Ward and Sears, Roebuck and Company utilized this national rail network to issue massive print catalogs to farmhouses across the country. A family living in rural Iowa could order standardized clothing, furniture, tools, or even prefabricated houses built in Midwestern factories, delivered directly to their local rail depot. Local village markets were absorbed into a single, seamless, national consumer economy. But as goods, money and management became standardized, one vital piece of network infrastructure remained completely unstandardized: time itself. By the autumn of 1883, the American railroad system encompassed over 100,000 miles of track, yet the industry was on the brink of operational paralysis. Conductors crossing from one regional rail network to another had to perform complex mental math to adjust their schedules across dozens of competing local rail times. In October 1883, a private association of rail executives, known as the General Time Convention, met in Chicago to solve the problem once and for all. The convention's secretary, a civil engineer named William F. Allen, presented a bold plan. Allen proposed dividing the entire continent into 4 standardized time zones centered on standard meridians of longitude 15 degrees apart, roughly 60 minutes of solar time. Every local sun time within a zone would be abolished for railroad operations and replaced by a single, uniform, standard time. The rail executives liked the plan, approved it, and set the implementation date for Sunday, November 18, 1883. On Sunday morning, November 18, 1883, the sun did not alter its orbit, and Congress passed no legislation. Yet at precisely 12 p.m., telegraph operators across North America transmitted a single directive from private rail managers, unilaterally resetting the clocks of an entire continent and abolishing over 300 local solar times to establish 4 standardized time zones. In New York City, local clocks were set back 4 minutes. In Chicago, clocks were set back 9 minutes. In Omaha, clocks were moved forward 14 minutes. Without an act of Congress or a presidential signature, private corporations had rewritten daily human routines across an entire continent. Reactions were mixed. Some religious leaders and local editors protested, arguing that altering the clock was an arrogant defiance of God's natural sun. The editor of the Indianapolis Sentinel wrote, "The people of this country will have to eat, sleep, and work by railroad time. The sun will no longer be the boss in Indianapolis." Yet within weeks, virtually every town, school, bank, and local government across the nation adjusted its public clocks to match the railroad schedules. Natural solar time was dead. The same corporate power that standardized national time could also impose arbitrary costs on the communities alongside the tracks. While standardized time and national markets brought unprecedented speed and economic scale, the network exacted a brutal human toll. the construction of transcontinental rail lines shattered the sovereign territories of plains indigenous nations. Railway corridors sliced through traditional hunting grounds, while market hunters, encouraged by rail interests, slaughtered an estimated 4 to 6 million bison between 1870 and 1880, systematically decimating the herds to secure land-grant territory and force tribes onto reservations. For the men who built and operated the iron grid, the work was notoriously deadly. Thousands of Chinese immigrant workers on the Central Pacific and Irish immigrants on the Union Pacific labored under dangerous conditions for unequal pay. In the 1880s, trains lacked automatic air brakes and automated car couplers. Brakemen had to run along the roofs of moving boxcars in rain, ice and snow to set handbrakes manually. To couple two train cars together, a worker had to stand directly between moving bumpers and drop a heavy iron pin into place at the exact second the cars slammed together. Thousands of rail workers were killed or maimed every year, triggering intense labor strikes that repeatedly paralyzed national trade. Simultaneously, rural farmers found themselves at the mercy of corporate rail monopolies. Because rail lines owned the only physical transport routes out of farming communities, executives engaged in systematic price discrimination. On long-distance routes between major cities like Chicago and New York, where multiple rail lines competed for business, freight rates were cheap. But on short-haul routes in rural Kansas or Minnesota, where a single railroad held an absolute monopoly over local towns, companies charged extortionate rates, often charging a farmer twice as much to ship grain 50 miles to a local elevator as they charged to ship that same grain 1,000 miles across state lines. As public outrage over discriminatory rates and corporate monopoly power grew, citizens turned to the federal government for intervention. By the late 1870s, enraged Western farmers organized political movements like the Grange, demanding that state legislatures step in to curb the predatory power of railroad monopolies. State governments passed laws capping freight rates, but in 1886, the Supreme Court ruled in the landmark Wabash case that individual states had no constitutional authority to regulate rail traffic that crossed state borders. If the railroads were a national network, they could only be governed by national power. On February 4, 1887, President Grover Cleveland signed the Interstate Commerce Act into law. The law outlawed short-haul rate discrimination, banned secret corporate rebates given to favored industrial trusts, and mandated that all freight charges must be reasonable and just. More importantly, the act established the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC. The ICC was America's very first independent federal regulatory agency. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress created a permanent body of presidential appointees, tasked with overseeing private corporations, auditing company financial records, and enforcing administrative laws over a national industry. The creation of the ICC marked a permanent shift in the relationship between the American government and private business. The federal administrative state, the vast network of regulatory agencies like the SEC, the FCC, and the FAA that govern modern commerce, was established specifically to supervise the private infrastructure built by the railroads. Even time itself was eventually absorbed by the state. 35 years after private rail executives established standard time on the day of 2 noons, Congress passed the Standard Time Act of 1918, also known as the Calder Act. The law officially granted statutory federal authority to the 4 time zones created by rail managers in 1883, placing their oversight under the Interstate Commerce Commission. Look closely at the world around you today, and you will see that the framework constructed by these 19th century rail companies never truly disappeared. Look around at modern daily life, and you will see that we are still living inside the institutional house built by 19th century rail executives. When you work within a corporate management hierarchy, file a status report with your supervisor, or read a divisional org chart, you are using organizational control systems engineered by Daniel McCallum and J. Edgar Thompson in the 1850s. When you check your 401k retirement portfolio, invest in index funds, or follow Wall Street stock charts, you are participating in a financial market structured specifically to raise capital for railroad tracks. When you buy standardized groceries at a supermarket or order goods online for home delivery, you are benefiting from a commodity and distribution architecture created by the Chicago grain elevators and the rail networks of the late 19th century. And when your phone automatically updates its clock as you land at an airport in Chicago or Los Angeles, you are obeying a spatial grid drawn up in a Chicago hotel room by private rail managers trying to keep trains running on schedule. The railroad did far more than conquer physical geography or move locomotives across the frontier. It forced a vast, chaotic, localized nation to operate as a single, synchronized corporate machine. The next time you look at your phone to check the time or open an org chart at work, look past the digital display. You are still operating within an organizational machine engineered by 19th century rail managers just to keep two steam trains from meeting on the